All right, in all the examples you have seen so far, we haven't talked about the server. And when I started learning about Redux, that was my first confusion. And as I researched in the community, I came across a concept called action creators for persisting the state on the server. Now, I'm not going to cover action creators because I see them as an anti-pattern. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you a simple way to bring server into this picture. And then if you're interested, you can look at the PDF I have attached to this lecture, where you can find my opinion on action creators and why you should stay away from them. All right, now for a second, let's forget about Redux. How do we work with the server in a typical Angular app? Well, here's our to-do list component, and you can see I have injected a to-do service in the constructor. Let's have a quick look at the implementation of this service. Very simple, like what you have seen in my beginner's Angular course. Here we have the endpoint, we inject the HTTP service in the constructor, and we have simple methods for CRUD operations. Now typically, to get the list of to-dos from the server and render them on the page, we implement the onInit interface. And here in ng-onInit, we use our service to get the items, we subscribe to the result, and we set the state in the component. So this is the non-Redux way. We get our objects from the server and store them in the component. So in this case, our component is maintaining its internal state. However, when using Redux, we don't store the state in the component like this. Instead, we dispatch an action. And then that action goes to a reducer, and then eventually, the state of the store gets updated under the hood. So to change this implementation and use Redux, I'm going to delete this line, and instead, call ng-redux.dispatch to dispatch an action. I'm going to declare a new action here. Let's call this fetch to-dos success. And I will tell you why I'm calling this shortly. Now, in the body of this action, we'll have all the to-dos we get from the server. So to-dos, we set it to to-dos.json. Now, optionally, we can dispatch another action before sending a request to the server. And we can use that to render a loading icon on the view. So I'm going to copy this line, paste it here. And then I'm going to rename this action to fetch underline to-dos underline request. And here we don't have a payload. Just a simple action. And then we can modify our reducer. So when we get an action like this, we can set a property in the store like this. Is fetching or is loading, we can set it to true. Of course, the Redux way, not like this. And then we can use this property to render a loading icon on the view. Now we can have another action in this group as well. So in the subscribe method, the second argument is for handling errors. So if the response to the server fails, we can get an error object here and then dispatch another action and call this fetch to-dos error. And here we can include the error. Okay, now this is a perfectly valid implementation if you are getting the list of to-dos only in one component. But if there are multiple components in your application where you get the list of to-dos, you have to repeat this logic in different places. What I mean is dispatching these three actions. If you have a scenario like that, it makes more sense to encapsulate this logic in a service. So we can go to our to-do service. In the constructor, we can inject ng-redux just like how we did in our component. And then in this method, before sending the request to the server, we can dispatch an action. And then we can modify this. So instead of returning the observable to the client, we can simply subscribe to it. And if we get the to-do successfully, we'll dispatch another action, which we call fetch to-dos success. And of course, we include the to-dos in the payload of this action. And once again, we also handle the errors here. So basically, we take all that logic from the component and encapsulate it in the service. In that case, it makes more sense to change the name of this method from getToDos to loadToDos, because we are not expecting anything from this method. Then in the component, in ng-onInit, instead of adding all this logic here, we simply call this.service.load to-dos. So this is how we get the data from the server. But how about posting data to the server? Well, let's take a look at an example. So here's our add to do method. Now this is the Redux way, but imagine we were not using Redux. How would we connect to the server? Well, we would probably have some code like this. So we would create a to do object, set the title to input.value. Then we would update the state on the client. So we would update our to-dos array like this. And then we would call the server like this. Now this is optimistic update. So first we are updating the client state and assume that the persistence of this object on the server is going to succeed most of the time. If not, then we will revert the changes on the client. So this is the non-Redux implementation. Now how can we change this to Redux? Once again, Redux is for maintaining the client state. So let's put the service aside. Instead of modifying the client state directly here, we dispatch an action. So this.ngredux dispatch an action like this. And of course the type should be add to do, right? Now here we have a tricky scenario. In our current implementation, we're generating the ID of a new to-do item on the client. So let's take a look at our reducer function. Look, we're getting the count of items in our array and adding 1 to it. But when we call our backend to persist a to-do item, this ID is most often generated on the server in the database. So back here, there are 2 ways to bring that ID to the client. The simple way is to use pessimistic update instead of optimistic update. So instead of updating the client state first, we call the server and subscribe to this observable. At this point, we have a to-do item object that has an ID that is generated on the server. And then we can dispatch an action that includes both the title of the to-do item as well as its ID. So this is pessimistic update. What if you want to use optimistic update to update the client first? Then you need to generate a unique identifier on the client first. And then when you get the response from the server, you need to correlate that server ID with the client ID. Let me show you what I mean by that. So before calling the server, we dispatch this action. So the client state is updated. And here we need to generate an ID that can be something like a GUID. Or in some cases, you can use date.now because that returns a number. And it's unlikely that in a to-do app, we will have 2 to-do objects that are created at the very same time. So with this, we add this to-do item on the client. Now, when we get the response from the server, we need to dispatch another action. And let's call this add underline to do, let's say correlate. And in this action, we can include the ID that we generated earlier, as well as the ID that we got from the server. And then in our reducer, we can find that object in our array and modify its ID. So this is how you talk to the server when using Redux in your Angular apps. Once again, Redux is for maintaining the client state, and conceptually, it should not worry about the server state. The concept of action creators as a solution to talk to the server is an anti-pattern, and it brings extra complexity in your implementation. So stay away from it and use the approach I showed you in this lecture.